Hi there, class. This video is going to continue our series where we're investigating arguments for and against the existence of God and asking, well, what should we rationally believe in light of those kinds of arguments? And we're going to do this by looking at the kind of position developed by Philip Goff in his article that we assigned for this unit. So we're going to start the video by looking at this kind of dilemma that Goff describes himself as finding himself in when he considers the arguments for and against the existence of God. And then we'll talk about how he thinks that we can try to find a middle ground that sort of goes between the horns of this dilemma. And he tries to do that specifically with his own view known as Cosmopsychism. And after we describe how that's supposed to provide that kind of middle ground, we'll end the video by considering some further issues that students might consider on their own. I'm not going to develop these issues in very much depth or detail, but rather just use them as food for thought for you to investigate on your own time. So we can get a handle on this dilemma by starting with this observation that serves as the basis for the fine-tuning argument. The idea is we look at the universe around us, and we notice that this universe we live in seems to be very fine-tuned for life. The laws of nature, the initial conditions, the physical constants seem to have the exact values, the very specific and precise values that they would need to have in order to allow for life to eventually develop. And so we might wonder, well, why is it that this universe just so happened to turn out to have those precise values? What explains why it has those values rather than others? Now, on one side, there's the traditional theistic view that says, well, there exists a all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, perfect deity, God, that created this universe, and that God would be able to set the dials exactly where they need to be in order to produce life. And since our universe is created by such a deity, that's why our universe is fine-tuned for life. So that attempts to explain it that way. But on the other side, there's this view, atheism, that rejects the existence of God. And now, traditionally, atheism is developed as a kind of atheistic materialism, we'll say, right, where the only things that exist are purely physical material substances, and they operate according to purely mechanical laws. So gears and levers, pushes and pulls. And on that view, if all there is matter, and then mechanistic laws to explain the behavior of matter, well, then it looks like the initial conditions, the laws of nature, the values that they have would have to be attributed to chance. But you might say, well, look, the laws of nature had to have some values. They had to have some starting conditions, and any of the starting conditions are just as likely as others, so the ones that allow for life are just as likely as any of the other laws of nature that might have been instead. And so we're perfectly willing to chalk lots of things up to chance, so why not just chalk up the fine-tuning of our universe up to chance? But Goff thinks that chance here doesn't really provide a good explanation for why our universe is fine-tuned for life, because the laws of nature had to be very specific values. It's so unlikely by pure chance that you'd get exactly these values rather than several other values that would never have allowed for life. The idea is like we have this giant dice with billions of sides on it, and only one or two of those sides would allow for life, and we just roll it by chance. It's extremely unlikely that you would get the one or two ways on that dice that would just happen to allow for life. And so the fact that chance makes it very unlikely that this universe would have these exact laws, it doesn't seem to be a particularly compelling or plausible explanation, is the idea. That's why he rejects this purely atheistic materialism. All right, so we've already discussed those kinds of reasoning quite a bit, and so I'm not going to repeat our evaluation of them thus far. But on the other side here, he says, the traditional theistic view also doesn't really seem to be the best explanation for the kind of universe we live in, but not because of the fine-tuning, but because we live in a universe where there seems to exist evil and suffering. And he thinks if there were a perfect deity, there wouldn't be at least gratuitous pain and suffering. But it looks like when we look around in the world, it looks like there is gratuitous pain and suffering. And so he rejects traditional theism as an adequate explanation for the kind of universe we observe ourselves as occupying. But now it looks like we're in this kind of dilemma because we have one argument that seems to rule out atheistic materialism and push us towards traditional theism, but then we have this other argument from evil that seems to rule out this explanation of traditional theism and push us towards the atheistic materialism. But his way out of this dilemma suggests that there's a kind of middle ground between these two views that can make sense of both kinds of arguments. And the idea here is that the fine-tuning of this universe doesn't actually point towards traditional theism necessarily, but rather it points to a kind of cosmic purpose, that we don't just live in a universe that is gears and levers just operating on purely mechanical procedures for how the history of the universe evolves. Instead, it looks like there's certain purposes that are fundamentally built into the universe that we live in. And now, traditional theism is one view that seems to posit that there is this fundamental purpose, but it's not the only possible view. So the idea here is that the argument from evil seems to argue against a very specific kind of theism, all right? And we can reject that kind of theism while also making sense of fine-tuning by accepting not the purely atheistic materialist worldview, but by accepting some other form of cosmic purpose besides traditional theism. And so that's why Goff thinks that we have very good reason to believe that there is cosmic purpose. It provides us with this middle ground between atheistic materialism and traditional theism. But at this point, we have to also consider this kind of atheistic materialist gambit that says, well, hold on, if we add in not just that the universe is the result of chance, but our universe is actually one of many that exist, with their own laws of nature and initial conditions, etc., we can explain the universe and its fine-tuning without appealing to cosmic purpose of any kind. If there's enough of these universes and they all have their own laws, if we take that dice and we roll it 10 billion times, well, eventually it would turn up with the one or two combinations of laws and initial conditions that would allow for life to develop. And it would do that as a pure random chance. But Goff thinks that this too is not an adequate explanation. He thinks fine-tuning doesn't actually provide us with good evidence for a multiverse. And here Goff says that this is because this kind of reasoning from the fine-tuning to a multiverse seems to commit what he calls the inverse gambler's fallacy. The traditional gambler's fallacy essentially goes like this. So you go to a casino, you're playing roulette, you put the ball in, and it sort of spins around until it falls and ends on red or black. Let's say it falls on black, and then it falls on black again, and falls on black again, falls on black again. And now you might think, okay, well look, it's fallen on black the past 5 times. It's got to come up at red at some point. So probably it's going to show up red this time. We ought to bet on red. That is a fallacy because those other instances don't actually affect the probability of the next instance. The inverse gambler's fallacy goes a slightly different way. Here's an analogy to understand how it goes. The idea is, imagine we enter a casino, and as we enter, immediately we see someone who's had an enormous string of luck. They won the jackpot, and then they won it again, and they won again, and they won again. At this point, you might say, oh, hold on, they are incredibly lucky, it seems. I guess the casino must be really full of people playing games tonight. And the idea here is that that is a fallacy, because even if there were thousands of people in the casino that night, and so someone might win, that doesn't actually increase the probability that that person would win. All right, that has no influence over how likely it is that that person would have that extreme amount of luck. And so the idea is it looks like someone who reasons from our universe is fine-tuned to this idea that there is a multiverse to explain it seems to be committing the same kind of fallacy. Even if there were multiple other universes, right, that doesn't change the probability that this particular universe would have finely tuned laws for life. And so it's still extremely unlikely that this universe would have that fine-tuned laws. So this is why Philip Goff insists, and so critical to this charge against the multiverse hypothesis is this idea that our hypothesis needs to explain not just the general evidence that there is some universe with fine-tuned laws, but the more specific evidence that this universe, our universe, has these fine-tuned laws. But that raises the question, if you reject that atheistic view and you reject the traditional theistic view, but you say there has to be some kind of cosmic purpose, the question is, what are those other views that allow for cosmic purpose and reject that kind of atheistic materialism without accepting this kind of perfect deity. What are those middle ground views? And here in the article we read, he only really discusses two. So one middle ground option is this idea, well, you could posit a supernatural deity that doesn't match those traditional characteristics. Maybe there is a limited being that's not all-powerful, that's not all-knowing, etc. And so this being creates a universe, but they are creating a universe with restrictions. And so because of that, they just don't have the ability to create a universe without evil in it. But Goff is ultimately going to reject that view in favor of the view that he calls Cosmopsychism. And this is the view that there is no outside creator of the universe. Right? There's no supernatural entity that is responsible for creating the universe. Instead, it's the view that the universe itself is a conscious mind with purposes and goals built into the universe itself, which thereby helps to explain the evolution it has towards life. You might think, well, why would you prefer that view of cosmic purpose over one that posits a kind of limited God outside the... So Goff's ultimate reason for preferring Cosmopsychism to this limited deity is what's known as Occam's razor. This idea we shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity. The simpler explanation is more likely to be true, provided, like, other things are equal. And so the idea is, well, Cosmopsychism and the limited deity would both explain fine-tuning and the evil in the world. However, the idea is Cosmopsychism looks like it's able to explain it by positing less stuff. All right? So on Cosmopsychism, the only thing that exists is the universe that we live in. It just so happens that the universe that we live in is a very different kind of thing than the universe that the atheistic materialism posits. But there's no additional supernatural stuff. Whereas the limited deity says there's not just the natural world, there's also this being that exists outside of the universe. And the idea is by positing that extra stuff, you have thereby complicated the hypothesis. It's less simple than the one that says there's only the universe itself. Occam's razor gives us reason to reject any kind of view or hypothesis that posits the existence of some supernatural God, even if it's a limited being in various ways, in favor of a view that doesn't posit any additional entities beyond the universe itself. So that's how he comes to this conclusion that the best explanation for the kind of universe we live in, the one that seems to be evolving towards life, is his own Cosmopsychism. So I want to close here just by mentioning a few things I want students to consider on their own, including a couple potential worries. So firstly, a lot of this reasoning that Goff engages in, and others who appeal to this fine-tuning argument, rests on this assumption that the laws of nature that we observe in the universe are what are called contingent things. They could have been otherwise. So yes, we have an inverse square law of gravity, but it's possible that there could have been a universe with an inverse cube law. But why should we think that these values of the laws of nature or the initial conditions of the universe are contingent? What if it were the case that those values were necessary things, so that they couldn't have been any other way than they are? If it's just part of the very nature of the universe that it has to have these laws and these values, then we don't need to explain why it has these values rather than others, because it couldn't have had those other values. Now, someone might say, well, hold on, but we can imagine, we can conceive of other kinds of universes operating by different principles than the ones we have. Well, why should we think that what we can conceive of is a good guide to what's actually possible about the laws of nature and initial conditions? All right, so yet again, this is just some food for thought. The next thing I want you to consider is, does the reasoning to a multiverse truly commit that inverse gambler's fallacy? And so in relation to this, I think it's actually pretty important for you to consider about, is it really right that we should posit that the evidence that needs to be explained is not just that there is a finely tuned universe, there's some fine-tuned universe, but that we need to explain why this universe is fine-tuned? I am worried that there's something tricky going on with the use of the word "this" here that might make this move illegitimate. But that gets tricky, and so this is just something I mentioned for students to think about. Now, a couple other things to consider here is, how is this Cosmopsychism view distinct from theism? Insofar as it posits that the universe itself is a conscious mind, why not just refer to that thing as God? Some things we can say is, well, look, that being, that conscious being of the universe, On Goff's view, it's not like an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being. So that's one difference from at least traditional theism. It's distinct from various kinds of views about gods because it doesn't posit that these conscious minds exist outside of the natural universe. So this conscious being is nothing supernatural. But in that regard, there is this view known as pantheism that tries to just identify God with the universe itself. And so if you think that the universe itself is a conscious being and it views the universe with purpose and goals, etc., how is this different than naturalistic theistic views that identify the universe itself as God? Maybe there is a difference, but it's not immediately clear what the distinction is. You might ask, well, how is cosmopsychism distinct from atheism as well? Because if you say this conscious mind doesn't qualify as a god, well, then the question is, well, isn't that to reject the existence of any kind of God, and doesn't that qualify as a form of atheism? And yet again, I think this comes down to traditionally the atheistic view has been associated with this idea that there is no purpose built into the universe. There's no goals that the universe is striving towards. It's tried to get rid of this kind of teleological explanation for what happens within the universe we live in. And it's tried to understand the universe as a purely material, mechanistic thing. And so at the very least, even if it rejects the existence of God, this cosmopsychism, it's still very distinct from the traditional kind of atheism that has traditionally been adopted. Now, lastly, I also want you to consider is, well, does cosmopsychism actually offer an explanation of fine-tuning? Because you still might wonder, well, hold on, okay, maybe the universe itself is a conscious mind and that mind has certain purposes built into it. But I also might ask, well, why don't we need some explanation for why that conscious mind universe exists rather than a purely mechanical universe without those purposes built in? And so you might think we don't have any explanation for why that kind of universe exists rather than other kinds of universes. And therefore, we don't have an explanation for why this universe exists. All right, so that's all for this presentation. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.